Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Tabletopped. I'm your host, Nick, and today we have a really special guest. You've probably heard me talk about my new kind of D&D group, my new campaign. We've actually talked about several things on the podcast based on that. However, today I have Derek on. He is one of my players, but he is also a celebrated DM. He has played many different TTRPGs, a lover of all things games, but he is a avid enjoyer of crunch in his TTRPGs, which on this podcast you probably have heard from the rest of the hosts, isn't super common for this group. So I really want to bring you on, Derek, to talk about this perspective, because I have always been sort of in this weird liminal place where I understand the sort of gaminess and like that is attractive to people, and people really love like 3.5 in D&D, but I came in at 4.0 and then beyond. So like I really sort of came in at least in D&D with like a very sort of mid-level crunch, and all of the games that I've really enjoyed when I've kind of spread my wings outside of D&D have been more Apocalypse World, like 2D6 systems or something that is very, very crunch light. So I wanted to bring you on to talk about why you love crunch and what it is that it brings to the games for you, because I think that I'm missing a complete perspective on this.
Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on. Celebrated DM is pretty generous, but I'll take it. I totally love crunchy systems. I love math. And I think one of the biggest, to maybe start my pitch, one of the biggest reasons that I really love a crunchy system, something that's very heavy in the math, is just that I like Legos. Like I like to take kind of pre-existing things and see what I can make out of them. That's one of my favorite parts about building a character, even in something like 5th edition, which has some math. It's a little crunchier than maybe Powered by the Apocalypse and whatnot, but ultimately gives you a lot of free reign. But I love taking chunks of characters and classes and abilities and piecing them together and seeing what I can make out of them. I think you had Kaylee on a while back, and we were talking about a similar thing. And I said, if you were building with Legos, if you were trying to make something cool, and somebody looked over your shoulder and said, you could actually make that look nicer if you made it out of clay. Yeah. You'd be like, oh, that's not really what I'm doing. I'm trying to operate within the constraints of these blocks. So that's definitely one attitude that I have towards a lot of TTRPGs. And I feel like the constraints of some of these crunchier systems actually enables more creativity.
Yeah, the sort of like walled garden approach where it's like I have limitations around me. How far can I push them while still remaining inside of them can really open up a bunch of creativity. That makes total sense. And I think because what you said is like stirring a lot in my brain of things that we can talk about. I kind of want to split the discussion into two, with one being from a player perspective and then one being from a DM or GM perspective. Yeah. Because what you just said when it comes to creating a character or playing a character, like I've talked on the podcast before about how character creation is a full game that is separate from the actual TTRPG later on that people play. Like one of my co-hosts, Shade, like literally has a document with like every variation of characters you can create in D&D because he just like loves to do the min-maxing and like building all these different characters for different concepts. So why don't we start there with like what crunch provides you? Because when I play something like Monster of the Week, you have these kind of archetypal or prototypical playbooks that are, they kind of give the vibes or the archetype of a character that you would see in Monster of the Week films or TV shows. So like you have like the Chosen One, which is your Buffy or whatever. And then you have, like the tech person, the kind of supernatural creature that is helping the monster slaying squad. All of these are in there. And then the crunch that it provides is that you can pick moves from the playbook, and so you can kind of customize your character but everything is coming from you role playing it essentially. So it's very crunch light. Now I want to kind of turn it over to you when it comes to using a crunchy system as a player and making your character. What do you think it provides you, and can you give us like some examples and kind of try to make the case for crunch in that way as well?
For sure. Yeah. No, and I think that your co-host and I are birds of a feather, because I also just have folders of characters I know I'll never play for campaigns that ended years ago. So
one time when I was inviting him, like we were going to play a campaign, and I was like, yeah, so everyone, if you could send me your character sheets so I can essentially write the first episode and like start making that happen. He was like, I have created a character for every playbook in Monster of the Week. What do you need in this campaign? And I was like, no, what do you want to play? And he's like, literally, I have made every single character that I would think of playing in all of these things. And he just like sent me 3 and I picked one.
Totally. No, I totally agree with that. I real kinship with them for sure. And even with the Holoplane campaign that you're running now, I came into it a little bit late, and I made a character moment of, I think. I looked around and saw what everybody's character was, and I thought, I bet a paladin would go great here. And
you're like, I see a supreme lack of healing on this table.
Surprising lack. Yeah. But yeah, no, Crunchy Systems as a player, I think arguably, this is maybe controversial given my title as the Crunch Defender, but I think I enjoy it almost more as a player than I do as a DM. Not because I don't think it's great when you're GMing a really crunchy system, but more because that feeling that I was describing before of kind of playing with Legos and trying to build something is enhanced when you then get to take that resulting creation and really like put it through like the grinder almost. You really get to pressure test it against the world being created by your GM. For me, creating a character, particularly in a crunchy system, it's like that scene from Apollo 13, they dump everything on the table and they're like, this is all they have up there. We need to figure out how to help save them with just this stuff. And I take kind of that attitude a little bit with my party. I think I know that this person's playing a monk and this person's playing a rogue and this person's playing a fighter. And what does our party need and how can I make it with just the pieces that I have?
Yeah.
And that feels very satisfying to me because with a very open game, kind of a crunch light, a very narrative focused, it can be fun to say, oh, I have this idea, I want to do this. And the GM just kind of waves their hands and maybe you make a roll and you figure out how to do it. But it can feel sometimes personally like the stakes are a little lower because I know ultimately, no matter what I say, the DM is going to find a way to make it work. And that is fun in its own way. But it's, in a crunchy system, it's kind of the opposite, right? It's like, I need to know the game well enough. I need to know my character well enough. I need to be strategic enough to pick the right choices, or at least something that stands a good chance of success. It really emphasizes like the game in tabletop role-playing game as opposed to the role play.
Yeah. And Kaylee, you brought her up. She actually said on her episode that, or maybe it wasn't I think it was on her episode, that she basically said the difference between, but she is a theater creator professionally. So like the difference between her job and us playing is the dice roll, the sort of random element or the like the mechanical part of it that decides whether or not what you just said is true.
Totally.
Like I jump on the table, I go to behead this orc. Okay, I'm going to roll the dice and I roll a 1. That actually doesn't happen. And that is the thing that is, different from just storytelling with your friends.
For sure.
I totally get this and what you're saying of like, I really like the idea that you are approaching it more from, okay, I have a very limited toolbox and I have it, but like, do you also see or feel as though the limitations of a situation? So like, you're a paladin. If you were alone in a dungeon in our game and you came up to like a vault door and you were a paladin, so you can't really pick the lock very well. You don't have this sort of skill set to do certain things. Yeah. Do you feel like the limitations in that sense, beyond what you were talking about of like a narrative solution, feels good? And like, why? Like, how do you approach that from like somebody who really likes the crunch in their game? Because me as a GM, like you said, like you kind of want to put people in a situation where they can succeed or they feel like they have the tools to do so. But there's also situations where, people have just not thought about the thing the way you were expecting, or they just end up in a weird situation. So like, can you talk a little bit about that, about like the limitations of characters and how that feels when it comes to playing with a crunch forward approach rather than, in a more narrative way?
Yeah, totally. And I will maybe start by adding just a disclaimer, right? Which is that I think no system can replace, effective communication between players and DMs. Totally. And like all of this is skills. I don't want people to leave this episode thinking like, oh, Derek thinks if you pick the right system, math just makes everything perfect. That's obviously not the case. But to your point about limitations, I think an underemphasized part of TTRPGs in kind of the modern era. And I know when I say this, it sounds like I was playing with Gary Gygax. I obviously wasn't.
But, Gary and I go way back.
Oh, yeah. We were way back in the OG wargaming days. No, but I think one of the underemphasized parts of TTRPGs in kind of the modern era right now is failure, is what happens when your character is confronted with challenges and they do not triumph. That's not always part of the like heroic fantasy when we imagine it. But you can look at any single piece of media, popular Star Wars or Lord of the Rings or anything really, and you will find that characters go through trials and tribulations and they grow from those arguably more than their successes, right? Like the actual character moments that have been the most kind of potent for me have been the situations where I have tried my hardest and have fallen short. And I think when we imagine a crunchy system, sometimes we think of, a video game where like you die and that's the negative outcome. And we don't want that for our characters in a TTRPG. So we think, let's reduce the crunch or let's make it so the characters can never die. But in actuality, I think failure can take a lot of shapes. And sometimes when you fail as a character in D&D in a crunchy system, it almost allows you to empower your role play in a way that you wouldn't get with a crunch light system or a more narrative based system, because you might not run into the opportunities to fail. And there's a secondary part of that, right? The DM isn't the bad guy if you fail, right? Often in a crunchy system, or something that's a little more number heavy or whatever, DCs are higher or something like that. The DM is just adjudicating the dice, right? That's pretty straightforward. If we're just, you and I are just like role playing without any dice, and I say I want to do something and you say no, you fail. Now I'm looking at you like, why? What the hell?
What the hell, man?
Why didn't you let me do what I wanted to do? And so it can just allow for more organic role play. And I think that's probably the single aspect I like most about well-made, very kind of crunchy and mathematical based games is it feels like something separate from me and the DM and my other players. It feels like an organic world and we're all kind of discovering the story.
I really love this because this is something that I think a lot about, which is how to deal with failure in storytelling, especially with TTRPGs, because there's a really hard thing where like one of my co-hosts, Franco, hates skill checks because they're a yes, no. It's just like, no, you don't open the door.
Right.
And like you said, it's like, it's not the DM saying like, blah, I'm trying to screw you over. It is the dice, the math saying you just aren't able to do that right now, or in this case. And then it sort of seems like for a lot of GMs that the next step then is to say, okay, well, you failed. Oh, now what do you want to do? But the player is sort of like, okay, but I need to get through this door.
Yes. Yeah.
And it becomes sort of like a weird thing of like a momentum sort of breaking aspect of a crunchy game. So as a player, how do you approach in a crunch system or a mathematic heavy system? You use something in your toolkit. It doesn't work. And you're just like, well, shit, it did not work. I can't do the thing I wanted to do. How do you move forward in a way that both feels good in a way that you were talking about, where you're saying, okay, I still have a tool, like a chest of tools that I want to use, and I am going to do something else to do that within my limitations? Or is it more like I am unable to do that, I then take a back seat and I have failed, I like go back to town, or what is it like? How do you approach that as a player?
Totally. I think that's a really great question. And I think there are two paths. There's maybe a lighter and a darker path. If we're being honest, I think one scenario, if we go back to your example about like, I'm a paladin, I'm confronted with a vault door. If I were a rogue, I could pick this lock, no problem, but I'm not, right? That kind of, maybe the darker path is to say, well, I want to do the thing. And even though I'm not good at it, I'm still going to try and do it because narratively it's important for me to get through this door. And then when I roll a 4, and I don't pick the lock, I
Mm-hmm.
get frustrated. I go back to town. I feel like there's the narrative halt here.
Yeah.
And that's challenging. And I think, honestly, in that type of situation and that path, the answer is probably outside of the system. It's probably
Mm-hmm.
more about maybe I need to get more in touch with my character and their motivations and think of it a
Mm-hmm.
little bit less like a linear kind of game that I have to play and more like an organic, I'm a
Yeah.
person and I need to have these goals. How do I go about it? It could also be maybe communication with the DM, right? To
Mm-hmm.
say like, hey, it seems like maybe I can't make it here myself, but it sounds like the story you're telling requires me to do so. Like, let's chat about what we're trying to build here. But that's frankly, I think that's the darker path. And what I actually think is the advantage of crunchy systems in this type of scenario is that before I even start walking down that path, before I even start
Mm-hmm.
going into the cave where there's a vault, I already know what I'm good at. I'm
Yeah.
looking at my tool chest and I'm seeing a hammer and I'm seeing a chisel and I'm seeing a sword or whatever, and I'm not seeing lockpicks. And
Yeah.
that helps to inform my role play going forward, right? I might know if I need to pick a lock or if I'm going to be confronted with certain things. Maybe I need to have some hirelings. Maybe I need to bribe the rogue with, promise of some of the treasure.
Yeah.
And I find that sort of, especially across a party, when everybody's
Mm-hmm.
kind of familiar with their character, mechanically, it can help them become more comfortable with their character narratively. And then that can make things a little bit more seamless when you
Mm-hmm.
enter combat or puzzles or dungeons, because now folks have an idea for what sorts of things they're already good at, what sorts of things they
Yeah.
might need help with, and where to collaborate.
I do. So, well, as you were answering it, it also sort of popped in my head exactly what you said around hirelings. Like the thing about like really crunchy systems is that a lot of times they've solved for a lot of this. Like
Yeah, yeah,
it's like usually deep in the rules, and it's rules that people maybe don't use ever and all that kind of thing. But
yeah.
if you're a party without rogues, you could hire some,
There's
or you
plenty of
can, like
rogues
you
out there
said,
in the world.
yeah, and you can do that kind of thing. And so you like it almost does allow you to say, we're terrible at all of this stuff. So narratively, it becomes important for us to find a way to do something if we get confronted with this. And it
Totally.
sort of like allows you to have a self-awareness of what your limitations are and prove your characters to overcome them with their wits in a way that is sort of narrative, but has already been outlined within the rule book as well. Do you know what I mean?
I absolutely know what you mean, and this gets maybe a little bit into the GMing side of things,
Yeah.
and we can pivot to that later if you want. But most of the stuff, most of these obscure rules, I can't speak to the actual design of some of these games, but I can imagine the creators of Dungeons and Dragons or of these different TTRPGs just improvising them and then realizing,
Yeah.
you know what, we actually are going to need this. Like, let's write this down. Because even if it doesn't happen often, every once in a while, you need to know how to improvise damage when a character
Yeah.
gets hit with lava or something
Yeah.
along those lines. And I don't want to give the impression to listeners that like you need to understand the entire rule set and memorize it perfectly in order to do a good job as a DM or to play these games. That's definitely not the case, but it is a good lesson sometimes to know that these rules exist, and if they exist, it's probably in a form that is like what I'm going to refer to as balanced. It can be easy.
At least play tested.
At least play tested. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you can relate to this. I can as a DM. Like your player wants to do something random, you improvise something on the spot, and then you realize, oh no, that was too much damage for pushing somebody off a cliff. Now they're going to just push people off cliffs all the time. And the rules that are play tested and hopefully a little bit balanced often can help you keep the world more or less consistent in a way that is more enjoyable long term for your characters.
Yeah, I do think I want to switch to GM side for a second. But before
Totally.
we do, I want to talk specifically around player mechanics because I went to a design conference once around TTRPG design. And the person giving the talk was saying, when you design mechanics, what you need to do is make sure, because there are 4 types of mechanics. There are easy mechanics that are very powerful, or by easy, I mean fun mechanics that are very powerful.
Gotcha.
There are hard or, unfun mechanics that are very powerful. And then there are unfun that are weak and fun that are weak. And
Yeah.
what you are trying to design for are fun that are weak. Because if you make fun that are powerful, people are just going to pull that one lever over and over again. Just like you were saying with the pushing people off a cliff. It's like you see it on Reddit all the time where someone says, I like keep pebbles in my warlock's pouch so I can throw them in the air and turn them all into cows. And then 40 cows drop on like my enemies and
totally
do meteor swarm level damage kind of thing. So when it comes to building your character and playing your character, the thing that I have sort of run into when I play in a mathematical system or something that is a little bit more walled garden-y is that there is very often an optimal choice. You know what I mean? Like there are spells in the player handbook that are just better to take and more useful than other spells.
Totally.
And but like as a player and as a GM, you sort of want to be like, but I want to do something different. I don't want to play the same builds every time. So can you speak a little bit to that and like how you kind of think about that? Because as somebody who likes that, like, a very mathematical system, you've definitely run into this kind of optimization sort of feeling.
Absolutely.
How do you kind of think about that, I guess?
No, I think that's a really great question. And I've run into that as the perpetrator and victim, you might say. I've made some really broken characters. And I think we might have mentioned this to you, but David is running like a Warcraft themed kind of one shot that's been it's been like a 3-shot at this point, but it is, I mean, we built some really, really broken characters with some ridiculous abilities. And I think the problem really kind of has 2 different facets to it. I think one side of things is that game design is really hard. And I can totally empathize with folks who are playtesting and designing systems that need to be consistent in experience across like multiple books and universes. Like that's very challenging. And we're all probably imagining, the like great weapon master fighter of D&D 5e when we talk about this stuff and things like that.
That's literally the exact thing I was thinking about of like, the before the 2024 rules update, but like great weapon fighting, you could do like great weapon fighting samurai, and it was completely busted because you could give yourself advantage every single attack and then also do the -10 +20 damage or whatever it was, and you would be a machine that would just mow through creatures from like level 3 or whatever. So that's exactly what I was thinking about when I was thinking about this question.
No, that's a pretty common one. I remember also in 2014 for a while there was the coffee lock, which is you multi-class into warlock and sorcerer, and you use meta magic to keep turning spell slots into sorcery points or something. Like I think there's always an element of the game design. Maybe we call it like cracks in the game design. And to me, in those situations, it's a little bit more about buy-in from your characters. As a DM, especially, I'm a really big believer in like everybody at the table needs to be bought into a few like core assumptions, like a few core values. One of them that I tend to require, and this is a little more strict maybe than most DMs, but I require that when we sit down at the table, our characters at a minimum are heroes in an adventuring party. They're going on a quest, or they're in a mission, or they live in a world where the goal is to do something. I don't necessarily support or allow like I'm a loner. I actually go off on my own because I find that it doesn't really make for a lot of fun at the table in the long term. So one of those values here is that you can make a character to fill whatever vision you want. I like sticking to the rules and as written and whatnot, but rules as intended plays a pretty core role, right? And I think if I'm your DM and you're kind of cheesing something such that you're getting like major mechanical advantages because of a weird wording or something, I often will maybe not ban stuff, but I'll kind of tamp that down or recommend that we pivot a little bit. But the second piece, and I think maybe the more related to the system piece, is that a lot of the underpowered conversations, especially you alluded to being on Reddit. I'm no stranger to like tons of spreadsheets worth of math on damage per round and whatnot. But those are happening on paper those are happening in a room where there's like a big monster and you're just hitting it every turn. And real worlds are more complex than that. Real TTRPG games are more complex than that. So I say, as a DM, it is important for you to both build a world that is engaging, but also if your characters are designed in such a way that they are like ridiculously good at something, there are ways for you to work around that. You can put enemies that are immune to non-magical damage. If your fighter has a mundane sword, maybe that's a little cheeky, but there's also terrain, there's also puzzles, there's also different types of enemies and mobility, lots of ways to really challenge your characters no matter what they're good at. And ultimately, even the most broken character that does 1,000,000 damage per round, I also believe let them. It's not the end of the world if the fighter wants to do really amazing fighting, in the same way that you want your really charismatic paladin to like charm people and whatnot. So yeah, it can be a challenge, and I think especially for new DMs. But I guess my overall advice here is just lean into it. Like if your players build really powerful characters, hit them with really powerful enemies.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you just said, and I think that it. Like you said, there's nothing that can beat the communication between the GM and the players, because I think a lot of times what happens when you have people saying like, oh, I hate crunch, or oh, I hate just like RP heavy or narrative heavy games, is usually that you have both people who want to do vastly different experiences at the same table, and then they are conflicting with each other, because like and we can start switching to GM side talk, but as a GM, it is so frequent that you will get like somebody at a table who is so like into their character and knows how to play their character, and they're just like very like, they're meticulous, they're planning, they're doing all this stuff that you would need to run a very crunch heavy campaign. But then you also have people at the table who are saying like, okay, can I use my fireball spell, but can I use it in like a really like directed way so that I can like bust this lock with like a miniature explosion? And then you're like, wow, that's a really cool idea, but like totally not what that spell does. So there's there's that tension at the table. So I kind of want to bring that out too, of when you have a table of people, even if they're all bought into playing math like a little bit more with the math and within the rules as written, you can have sort of like disagreements on perspective of like what a spell does, or what an experience should be, whether something is fair or not. Like you were talking about creatures that are immune to non-magical damage and nobody has a freaking magical sword, and you're like, oh shit, well, what do we do? So as a GM, as we start shifting over to that perspective, what's your sort of take on crunch systems and building something for a party that will have unique needs? Each person might have different expectations of an adventure, and even you might be in the middle of a campaign and these things start arising out. So how do you kind of think about that as a GM when you're playing in a crunch table, I guess?
Totally. No, I think that's a really good question, and I think a really reasonable concern, especially as a campaign goes on for a long time, potentially. One thing that I will double down on, and I'm sure everybody has thought of this or heard of this in some form, but session zeros are really important for that kind of expectation setting. People, that's not super controversial, but you don't have to do session zero just before a campaign. Mm-hmm. I think you can have regular check-ins, and frankly, you should, right? I think it's very powerful to step out of the world for a second and to check with your players and to say, how are things going? How are we feeling about the direction? How are we feeling about the mechanical side? Usually you're not going to like pivot to a new system in the middle of a campaign. But at the very least you can get tabs on how how your players are feeling about that sort of stuff. If the campaign is going in a direction you didn't know it would from the beginning, is that a positive change, a negative change? How are you feeling about that? So that's one piece, which is more just general communication. Mm-hmm. But as a GM, I think the idea of fairness can be kind of tricky. And I think that ultimately what fairness looks like for TTRPGs is that everybody is having a good time, and the parts that are adjudicated by chance generally, because people are usually fair to each other. You know, a DM is rarely going to say, you get this cool sword and you get nothing. But sometimes it can feel like random chance can negatively impact folks more than others. And I think that fairness in a system with a lot of crunch often revolves around players being confronted with challenges that are satisfying for them to triumph over, right? And those challenges can be various different things. But ultimately, you want to feel like your character is growing. You want to feel like your character is doing good things, maybe not morally good, depending on your campaign, but is like doing well at things. And as a DM, the balance to strike there often, I think this is sometimes referred to as like shoot your monks, maybe, where it's like monks have the ability to catch projectiles. If you never shoot at them, they never get to feel cool. They never get to like be the badass that grabs an arrow out of the air. So for a crunchy campaign, especially when you have a very diverse party, you have to present challenges that each of them can triumph in. And similarly, that each of them can fail in, and they can hold each other up and be a party that ends up triumphing over the long term because of all of their shared strengths. And that's, again, it's difficult. But to me, that's really what fairness is more about than like the specific bonuses that any player has.
Yeah. This is something that I think about all the time, especially in Holoplaying, because usually I don't actually play in D&D anymore as much, just because I'm like trying different systems, trying new things out. But first of all, I want to say, like, I really love what you said about like making people feel cool, because like even in different systems like Delta Green or Mothership or other systems that are a little bit more math heavy, where you have a very specific skill tree where it's like you have a 10% chance of succeeding on like explosives checks, you have a 20% on like technology checks, like there's like huge pages of skills that you like literally build. And even in like Pathfinder, you have like the ability to pick specific feats to really build specific characters. And I do think it is upon the GM to make it feel like, wow, I built the right type of character. My choice to invest in something means something in this world because I've had to use it a couple times. So
For sure.
I do really love the idea that it's a responsibility of a GM to put forward into their encounters things that their characters can do and that they might not be able to do without each other, but that together the accumulation of all their skills will get them there. I think that's a really good way to avoid some of the stop and start narrative that we were talking about earlier of like, I'm a paladin, I come across a huge vault, what do I do? But I do want to say, when building encounters, and this is something I've struggled with in the Holoplaying group, because this is a group of different skill levels. Like some people are very new to the system. Some people are like you are very much more, old hat. And some people are very familiar with the rules. And some people are much more interested in sort of the narrative ability of being able to talk through certain things, or like, can I use this in this weird way? And I'm, as a GM trying to honor all of these different things. And like, as I've seen you at the corner of the table when someone's like, oh, Nick, you're being unfair, and you're like, he is giving you guys anything you want. Like, I would have destroyed you.
Just wait for my one shot. Yeah.
But I've been struggling a little bit with how to build encounters, because it is so hard to serve all these needs, especially when it comes to the idea that characters, not only do the players have different needs, but the characters themselves. Because like, you as a paladin, mechanically you are built to heal, deal damage, and you have a high charisma stat, so you can do some face stuff. When I build an encounter, I want to be able to create mechanical things for you to do that satisfy those. But I also know that all of these other people have things that I need to mechanically build into an encounter. And then it becomes this huge, Rube Goldberg machine of like different things that are going off at the same time, and like different things that people can use their abilities on. So as a GM, how do you go about building satisfying encounters? Because that can, any small encounter can become these huge time consuming bundles of rules that you're implementing to try to satisfy all masters. So what do you think about that when you're doing your due diligence as a GM?
Totally. No, that's encounter building is probably one of the core maybe proficiencies of GMing. I think if anybody perfectly figures it out, they'll win the Nobel Prize in DMing. I'm sure. It's definitely a challenge. I think the one thing that I'll plug is not related to me at all, but it's a book that I really love. It's called The Monsters Know What They're Doing, and it's by Keith Amon, and it is essentially an attempt. If you read through it, I think it started as maybe a blog series or something, but it is an attempt to take each stat block, each monster in the monster manual, and put it in context. A displacer beast, for example, right? You sit down and you look at the stats and the abilities of this displacer beast, and you imagine in a universe where this exists, how does it behave? How does it interact? It's the easiest form of combat to run in tabletop RPGs is one side whacks the other side hits them back. Eventually one side's HP is done, and then you move on. And that's not super engaging. And I think we all strive to do better than that. And this book has helped me a lot to understand what are the motivations of different enemies, what are the abilities of different creatures. To go back to the displacer beast, right? It has stealth and kind of magical hiding abilities. It has kind of a panther looking form. It can like grab enemies. It has high movement. This is obviously like an ambush predator, right? An ambush predator is going to sneak up on you. It's going to be hidden. It's going to jump out of nowhere. But similarly, it's not going to stand in the open and like fight to the death. Right. So it's also going to run or try to escape if it's hurt. And these really thinking about the enemies that you're building into your encounter as living beings with their own motivations, their own desires and intelligences, it can help with encounter design a little bit more because it gives you opportunities like, for example, your paladin with high intimidation might be able to scare off some of the goblins and not have to use their sword or kill them. Or your rogue might be able to slip away because the ogre is not very observant and doesn't have very high intelligence. And you can kind of work with encounter design a little bit there. And then one other point on kind of helping all of your characters to shine. And this was probably my hardest lesson to learn. It took me probably the longest to internalize. But campaigns are long. And sessions can also kind of be long, but you might play with a group of people. My longest running campaign, I've been playing with folks for 7 years now. And that's a very long time for character growth. And not every player has to shine like every session or every moment. You want it to be fun for everybody overall, but it's also totally reasonable for, the rogues side quest line where they're, I can only think about Bird. I don't have an example with Bird, but it's just from our campaign. But like they might have a really powerful moment where they, go through this huge character growth and they fight this big battle and they might be the center of attention for this session. And I used to feel an incredible pressure to say, well, if that's going to happen, I need another big moment for this character. I need another big moment for this character. We have to fit it all in 3 hours, and that, I think that makes the Rube Goldberg machine that you're describing that much more complicated. So relinquishing sometimes a little bit of the, like, everybody needs to get a treat this session and really leaning into like, I'm building a world where everybody will have these moments and they'll come at their own kind of natural pace that can make your life as a DM just that much easier.
Yeah. One thing I want to talk about on this point too, because I think that one of the most kind of game changing moments for me when it comes to encounter design is to think that about the different, and everyone talks about like the different pillars of TTRPG. There's like the combat, the social, the skill check, and all that kind of thing. But if you look at D&D specifically, you can see that combat mechanically is so much more fleshed out than a lot of other aspects of the game. So like when you're doing social interactions, you have some skills that are going to apply there. But when you think about combat, not only is it like you have a skill of how good you swing your sword, you have like different abilities with your sword, you have different types of swords, you have, all of these different things that are, people can feel really good about changing and using specific and making choices like you were talking about earlier. How can you as a GM utilize and kind of wield other parts of games to make people feel good? Like if you're even building a combat encounter, but you have a skill monkey rogue or something like that just isn't built for combat, but people are doing crazy, amazing things. Like for me, I've always tried to put there's something happening that really would help if you had somebody who is going over there and really tinkering with like this thing that's about to explode. So like that could be great. But like, how do you as a GM really approach that sort of building for a party? Because like not all parts of a TTRPG are made equal. And if you are really like everyone is really kind of adhering to the rules of the game and the math of the game and trying to play within their limits and play with their toolbox, they want to use it in a cool way. So how do you kind of approach that sort of problem?
Yeah, for sure. The three pillars of Dungeons and Dragons are certainly not equal by any means. I think one of my, don't at me if you work for Wizards of the Coast or something, but I think
all of the Wizards of the Coast people have long since destroyed every sort of phone in the office that has a tabletop podcast episode on it.
Thank goodness, I guess they won't hear what I'm about to say. No, but I think that is one of my bigger disappointments from D&D 5e 2024 is that the fix kind of appeared to be more of what you're saying, where they acknowledged that combat was kind of supreme, and they more just kind of reshaped most stuff to fit that mold.
Because now you have like influence actions and things like that, which is like kind of a nod to it. But like you said, it's still like, okay, you guys got us.
Right. It still feels a little underdeveloped. So I totally can agree with that. And when I imagine, I think this is what it was in 2014 D&D 5e. And I know from other systems, you really have your combat pillar, your social pillar, and then much less common nowadays is your exploration pillar. Is kind of how you explore the world.
Is so underdeveloped. Like, oh my god,
very much
like
so.
You have exhaustion mechanics and stuff like that, but even those don't really make sense all of the time. And then you have things like Goodberry that just completely invalidate parts of them, and it's just like
neutralizes a long travel. Totally, and those things are challenging. For sure. And I don't know that I have the optimal system to test this out, but I think one thing that I would push folks to do, if you're sitting here and you're listening and you're like, you know what, I do want to try that. Like, I want to really do like a rules focused, maybe you're excited about the prospect of like a gritty realism, where you have to track rations and whatnot. I would push you to do so. I would say that everybody should try leaning into the rules that exist, as underdeveloped as they might be. For combat, we don't have to really get into that because everybody's mostly familiar. But for social encounters and for exploration, the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook, even, they do have rule sets that are very, very underutilized. They're not perfect. For social encounters, often there's an attitude tracking kind of system, right? Where a hostile NPC has these characteristics, behaves in this way. Even the highest possible skill check will only convince them to do a certain amount. It will shift them from hostile to neutral, maybe. But you can't convince an evil lich to like give up his phylactery if you roll a 30. Like, it doesn't matter how high your skill check is. And by leaning into those numbers, I think you'll find that it can help alleviate some of that crunchy system issue with like non-combat actions. In certain cases, I've also seen success with like, in the same way you might improvise damage if somebody pushes a box from the second story onto somebody's head, you could do the same thing with social checks, right? Or other types of skill checks. A sleight of hand to take somebody's weapon, or a stealth check to like get behind somebody so that they can be tabletopped, and knocked over. And with exploration, similarly, I would say if you've never done like a classic hex crawl, I absolutely recommend it. It's a very kind of old school way to play the game, to be like navigating a huge world map, 20 miles at a time and discovering things. There's a lot of like random encounters, but you can really get a feel for being a small pawn in a huge world, which is a sensation that I think you don't feel a lot in TTRPGs.
I feel like especially in this kind of generation, like a post-actual play TTRPG landscape, I feel like they've shifted more to be more like movies rather than like maybe books, where like you might be, in Robin Hood, you're dealing with like, King John or whatever, but they're like, the other king is in the Crusades, and that's like way more important than whatever's happening around this like small area of England.
Right.
So it is sort of like has been a shift to be a little bit more player centric, like where the players go, the world follows kind of thing. So I totally agree there. And I also agree with you that like people should try out all these things, because at the very worst, you're like, this isn't for me. I'm not super into this mechanic. We can let that drop. But one thing I wanted to kind of maybe sort of start coming to an end on, which is sort of addressing the dissonance, the story dissonance of rules versus what like should, and I'm using air quotes for our audio listeners, but like what should happen. So like, for example, maybe you've been hiding under, a wagon, and you perfectly stealth up to someone. You grab them and you say, I slit their throat. And it's like, okay, roll damage. It's a dagger, D4 plus whatever. This guard has 50 hit points. Like, you know what I mean? It's like, especially at high levels, it can be sort of like this sack of hit points versus kind of it creates this sense of like, what is happening in this world, because it doesn't make sense to me as like a person thinking critically. So I want to talk a little bit about narrative dissonance or player dissonance, because especially when you're mapping it out, crazy things can happen sometimes. Like it could be that like a goblin kills your level 20 character, and it's like, what the just happened? Like, why did this happen? So I wanted to hear a little bit of your thoughts on this, and also maybe some things for DMs or GMs when they're trying to do their best in these kind of systems to make it all make sense, but also trying to stay within the rules as written. So do you have, that was a very long, windy way of saying this, but like, how do you approach that, I guess?
No, totally. No, that does make sense. I think the insta-kill, the sneak behind, slit the throat has been a problem in TTRPGs for forever. I don't know that I've ever seen a system totally nail it, if we're being honest. But I do think that there are a few approaches, and I'll try not to fixate too much on that specific example, but there are a few approaches for dealing.
To use it plenty, because it's literally one that happened to me once, and I was like, this feels really bad.
Yeah, I think it's happened to all of us, where we realize the rules do not live up to our idea for what should be happening. And I think this is like such a pretentious thing to say, but ultimately the map is not the territory, right? Like the rules are a way to like adjudicate what happens with dice and pencils and paper. So it's not the be all end all for anything that can happen in the universe. And this is a scary thing sometimes, but I would push all DMs to acknowledge, or to try out, that if your players can't fail, or if they can't succeed, if the outcome is not in question, they shouldn't be rolling dice. It should just be something that is narrated, or is something that is a part of the world. And depending on the enemies and depending on the level of the characters and the circumstance, for me personally, if there's like a 20 hit point guard and you get the drop on them and they're just a regular human, they don't have magical wards or something, I would say that the rogue probably just kills them, and that might not feel particularly crunchy in that moment. But I would say the ultimate rule of like the DMs say is kind of final. I think that is a tool in your toolbox. Even in the most rigorous mathematical games, I think you can still use that. The other, I
do love, sorry to interject, but like, I do love the idea that one of the core mechanics is the decision on whether or not a character has to roll dice. Like that is something that I think a lot of people forget, where it's, I love this idea of, if something is not in question, like if your characters have outwitted you, which I think is, a lot of GMs fear. It's my favorite thing.
Like it's beautiful.
I was once playing in a game, and this was in a rules light game, but like, I had created essentially Strahd in this alternate universe that was like the good portion of Strahd that had escaped his realm, but was still like being pulled back into it. And and it wasn't even he was good. He was just like open to redemption, essentially. And he had been helping the characters in this very specific thing so he could reunite with his other parts of himself. And he was in this sort of like liminal space between dimensions. They had just done this huge thing together, and they're like walking him over to the portal that will bring him back to his world and let him sort of like reconnect. And my character was like, so what do you think is like, do you think you'll remember all of this when you like regain your other part of yourself? And I was like, I don't really know. And then in this sort of, liminal space, they all had these astral cords that were connecting them back to their home reality. And if they had been cut, then they would essentially dissipate into mana.
Right.
And my character said he looks at Strahd and he cuts his cord. And I was like,
Damn.
you got me, dude. Like, yeah, Strahd, like, you have made the decision that you don't want to take the chance that when he gets reconnected with all of his powers, that he doesn't become a total bastard again.
Totally.
And
Big
by
swing.
doing that, and you sort of like have used my own logic to say, okay, well, I do this. He's not expecting it. We are allies. It's out of combat. I just sort of slit this cord and he dissipates. And at that point, it was like, do I make him roll? Like, oh, Strahd has supernatural senses, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, he outsmarted him. Like, this is what narratively would happen.
Yeah, for sure. And I love the idea too, that like ultimately what you're doing, it's a game, and there's like an organic side to it because of chance and whatnot. But ultimately what you're doing is you are creating a story together with your friends. And that is the big picture goal, in the same way that like whether or not you roll is kind of the ultimate rule. To me, that's like the ultimate goal of a campaign. And so you have a lot of flexibility when your players outsmart you in either direction, right? I think sometimes we're also afraid to, if our players are maybe too cheeky by half and they're like, well, technically I can do this thing to make sure that I sneak up on the king or whatever. You can also find a way to avoid that is still satisfying. You don't have to just let your player have an idea and then immediately beat the BBEG without any consequences, right? There are lots of ways to temper that while still being satisfying, and let the narrative guide you, I think is maybe my advice there, right? In that example you gave, like, it was not unsatisfying for this decision to just work, right? It might have been unsatisfying if you had to roll a die and you rolled a 1. Like, that wouldn't have been rewarding, that creativity.
Yeah. You were saying, though, that on the flip side of this idea of the decision whether to roll being the kind of mechanic of above all the others, but I totally interrupted with this tangent. But what were you going to say about the other side of the coin?
Oh, no worries. Yeah, I think for me, the most common time I hear that is when people talk about if something is impossible, don't let your players roll. If a player says, I want to jump to the moon, don't let them roll, because then when they roll an @20, they're going to be like, good on the moon. But I think it's just as legitimate.
I've done it.
I've made it. I'm up here. I think it's just as legitimate in the other direction, right? If your players can't fail at something, or if there's no reason they would, don't force them to roll. I think it is one of the biggest indictments, and maybe I'll be my own critic now. It's one of the biggest indictments of a really crunch heavy system, that statistically a level 20 fighter is going to roll way more nat ones than a lower level character, because they make more attacks. That's an artifact of the dice that isn't always satisfying, but you don't have to allow that to permeate throughout the rest of your player experience, right? So you got to be a little bit cautious, because you don't necessarily want your players to just like go around insta killing every enemy that they can find, or you want them to engage with the meat of your campaign and the core of the game. But at the same time, let your players do things that are commensurate with their skills. And this is where I sometimes lean on, it's not a mechanic, so to speak, but the D&D breaks the level progression to like tiers, right?
Yes.
And what I love about the tier system is the way that it is sometimes phrased as tier 1 is your characters are dealing with things that can affect like a region or like a village, small scale threats. Tier 2 is like a broader, country or nation or something. Tier 3 is like the whole world. And then tier 4 is like multiverse, gods, huge problems. And at each of those tiers as a DM, you can be cognizant of what are the things that somebody dealing with this size of a threat or interacting on this scale can't do, and what can they do. And then you can make sure that the challenges presented actually make sense, and that the decisions they're making, if they're well within their abilities, maybe they just work. Or if they're well beyond their abilities, maybe they just don't work at all.
Yeah, I think that's huge. Of like a high level, a level 11 rogue or something getting the drop on, some Joe Schmo card in the countryside. Yeah, then you can kind of say like, you're of a caliber at this point that you don't have to. I think that's a really interesting way to address that too. One last thing I want to talk about, because we didn't really address it, was, and this is just sort of a comment for me, and I just want to see what it rouses in you. But like, the GM not being the enemy kind of idea is so great, and I subscribe to it fully. But I also think that the joy of a crunch system, like you said earlier, is that the GM has to follow the dice too. Like, you know what I mean? Like, they are rolling for health of their characters for attacks. If you roll low, it's just, you know, your enemies miss, or they, you know, their shield breaks, or something terrible happens, and bad things can happen to the encounters that you've painstakingly built for your people to run around in. So, like, I wanted to sort of just pose that comment to you and see if it brings up anything of like, how should GMs feel about being beholden to the crunch of the game as well? And is there anything that you have internalized as a GM to make that more part of your philosophy of games?
Yeah, I think the short answer is 100%. It applies to the GM as well. I am no easier on myself than I am on my players. The slightly less intense answer is that you have a GM screen for a reason. I do not necessarily endorse fudging dice rolls because I think that the stakes are what makes the story that much more rewarding, right? If there's no chance of failure, then you're not really succeeding, right? Ultimately, I think you're just kind of telling a story, and I love storytelling. You know, you sit around the fire and tell stories, but that's not necessarily what I'm looking to do when I'm running a game. I think the same principle for how constraints enable player creativity, I think also enable GM creativity. I think knowing that I have a certain amount of monsters that have certain abilities, that I've built my own box, so to speak, by creating a world whose rules I have to follow as well. I find that that's really rewarding in designing campaigns. And I think that this is not for everybody. I challenge you, especially if you are very crunch light in general, I challenge you to try and run or play games like this. But in almost every one of my campaigns, character death is very real. It's very on the table, and very rarely will I cheese you out of it. I think what I do at the beginning of these campaigns often is I would lay it all out there expectation wise, and I say that you can get yourself killed. I'm not going to try and kill you. I'm trying to build a world, but this world is hostile. This world has real repercussions, and there are many systems in which character death is like not the most exciting thing. But there are also, I think, games where character death is something that can be very cool. It can allow you to, especially if you like building characters, as I know your co-host and I are big fans of. And that comes with its own challenges. But ultimately, I think absolutely, if you're playing a crunchy system, especially if you're being kind of hard on your players, you should hold yourself to the same standards. And the thing that I'll maybe call out and steal from Brennan Lee Mulligan is kind of the box of doom, like the dice roll of doom, is a really fun mechanic or a really fun way to play with that, where particularly important rolls are kind of made in the special box in front of the table. I often, as a GM, will roll in front of the table, and that removes this sense of finger on the scale. You know, it makes it very visible. Big moments are big because everybody at the table, including the GM, doesn't know what's going to happen. Nobody does, except the dice.
And it's the joy of shared discovery. You're allowing the players to include you in that as well. So it's not like you are arbitrating a decision, you roll something that they can't see, and then you say, this is the result. It's let's all find out what happens together. So that I think that's a really smart way to go about it. And I always another way to sort of take that responsibility off of yourself. If you're a GM and you're like, oh yeah, I'm having such a hard time, I keep rolling 20s and I'm just absolutely annihilating these characters. This is not the way I foresaw this going, but like I want to keep myself to this sort of standard that I've set. A way to do that is by giving your players the ability to roll those dice. Like as a GM, you can roll behind the screen, you can roll in front of the screen, all that stuff. But like I sometimes for like heisty kind of stuff, if I have sort of a dice mechanic around like whether a guard shows up, like if you roll this D6 and it's a 6, a guard is going to show up because you haven't memorized the schedule. You're in a random room. We don't know what's going to go on here. I'm going to let the table roll that. But they all know the response. They're like, there is no cheating your way out of, once you tell them what's going to happen, like what the result is of a dice, it's like, it doesn't matter who rolls it, really.
Totally.
So like by giving, that's my little cheat there too, is like, if you're having a hard time pulling the trigger on some of those, let your players roll it. They will feel a sense of sort of like kind of gleeful dread.
Gleeful dread is exactly the feeling. They're excited to be rolling the dice and they are dreading the outcome.
Exactly. Well, Derek, thank you so much for coming on and providing a much needed perspective on this podcast. I feel like we get really into the story parts of this kind of genre of hobby we love, and we get into, like, we've done a lot of rules reviews and system reviews and module reviews, but we've never really gave the true case for crunch of like why it is actually fun to not allow your characters to do the crazy actual play moments and really follow the rules. You know what I mean? It's a game that has a rule set, and that other sort of perspective that I just was talking about, that gets a lot of airtime on this podcast. We very much advocate for following like rules and making sure that you're not like, just letting your characters do whatever they want. But at the same time, I'm a huge fan of narrative-based systems. So I really appreciate you coming on and talking about it. Anything you want to plug, anything that you want to point people's direction or point people in the direction of? Is there a specific system you really love that is like the embodiment of the joys of crunch? Is there, the book that you mentioned earlier, I think is a great sort of suggestion for people to read. I think Franco has also read that. And I totally love that sort of way to look at things, because you can make encounters hard not by jacking up skill stats or whatever, but what if the creature just like lives on the ceiling and like ropes like down and like grabs people and brings them up to the ceiling to fight them up there, and like they're level 3, so they don't have all these crazy gravity defying spells yet. Like the way things hunt is a great way to go about it. So anything you want to point people towards?
Yeah, for sure. I would say, like my challenge earlier, lean into it. There's never, you can never play too much D&D, if you ask me. You can never play too many RPGs. So try out systems. Some of the ones that I personally enjoy in the terms of like more crunchy, Pathfinder, playing Pathfinder 2nd edition is very cool. GURPS is great. It's kind of a more generic one, maybe a little more old school. There's also a one that I recently discovered called Stars Without Number. It's more of a sci-fi. And honestly, just plugging like make a character the old-fashioned way. Go right down the lists. Roll your strength first, 3d6. Roll your constitution, your dexterity. Try a hex crawl. Do really stringent like social dynamic rules. Just see how it feels. I think worst case scenario, you hate it. You throw it all away and you play Monster of the Week. But you might discover that you really like something.
Yeah, I think that I'm going to revisit lethality on the podcast before, because I want to get like you and Danny, who's somebody that we both know, get him on the podcast because he loves lethal systems. Maybe have my friend Mac come back on because he's been running a lethal game that I've been playing in. But like you said, my favorite story moments in games as a player has been from a incredible, like, I just got completely screwed. There is no way out. This is my last chance to make a big swing and I'm going to try. And then like something happening in there and then you having a amazing character death. Like that is like, to me, sometimes like, because endings create the arc. You only see what your character's arc is when you know where it ends. You know what I mean? So
totally,
it's a great thing.
Totally agree.
Cool. Then we'll have you back on the podcast soon to talk about that. But Derek, thank you so much for coming on. And I hope everyone enjoyed this conversation. If you want to hear more, we do in the summer, we're kind of doing a little bit of a different schedule where we are releasing twice a month or every other Monday. And in the fall, we're going to reevaluate if we go back to weekly. If you have feelings on that, you can go to our website, tabletopod.com, and send us a contact form submission. We read every single one of them. If you want us to go back to a different schedule, or if you are liking the twice a month sort of schedule, let us know. We would really love to hear it. And if you have a specific topic, we would love to hear that as well. And as always, everyone, have a great time playing games with your friends, and we will see you next time for another episode of Tabletopped. Goodbye!